This is Noir Alley, and I'm your host, Eddie Muller. Today I've got a yarn from the well-worn typewriter of one of the 20th century's most prolific, if largely forgotten, authors, William Riley Burnett. It's Nobody Lives Forever, made at Warner Brothers in 1946. From the beginning of talking pictures, W.R. Burnett had the Midas touch, cranking out novels and short stories that were essentially camera-ready, including such early 30s hits as Little Caesar, Beast of the City, and Dark Command. His 1930 novel, St. Johnson, about the legendary shootout at the OK Corral, would be adapted for the screen 3 times by 1940. Noir Alley has previously shown High Sierra and The Asphalt Jungle, Burnett crime capers that were both landmarks in movie history. Burnett's wordsmithing made him a very wealthy man during the Depression, but his high living, in addition to his side gig breeding racing dogs, bankrupted him by the start of the 40s, which is when Burnett hunkered down and really went to work, churning out novels, adapting other writers' books into screenplays, like Graham Greene's A Gun for Sale in 1942, which became This Gun for Hire, as well as creating original movie treatments. Once in a while, he pulled off a spectacular parlay, as was the case with today's film. Warner's paid Burnett to concoct an original story as a starring vehicle for Humphrey Bogart. But Burnett had a clause in his contracts stipulating that any film based on one of his stories had to be made within a certain amount of time, or else he could take back the story and turn it into a novel, which is exactly what happened here. He sold Nobody Lives Forever for serialization in Collier's magazine in 1943, and then sold the hardcover publication rights to Alfred Knopf in 1945. Warner's then paid Burnett again for the rights to the novel, and paid him yet again to write the screenplay. That's not a trifecta, it's the quintfecta. He got paid 5 times. This kind of shrewd dealing, largely orchestrated by his savvy agent, H.N. Swanson, got Burnett back in the chips and allowed him to live comfortably to a ripe old age, writing all the way, until eyesight failed him in his final years. When Nobody Lives Forever finally went into production, Bogart was unavailable, gearing up to star in The Big Sleep. But his fill-in was no come-down. John Garfield was hot as a pistol when this film was released, because only several weeks earlier, The Postman Always Rings Twice had opened nationwide, and his sexy chemistry with Lana Turner created one of the biggest box office smashes of the year. The sparks he gives off here, with co-star Geraldine Fitzgerald, aren't as intense, but that's largely because Burnett wasn't the same kind of writer as James M. Cain. Burnett's forte was putting his characters under pressure, not throwing them into passionate clinches. The romance here is demure, even sweet, as Fitzgerald's character, a wealthy widowed wallflower named Gladys Halverson, melts the hardened heart of Garfield's veteran grifter, whose cohorts are trying to bilk Gladys out of her fortune. The noir vibe is supplied mainly by director Jean Negulesco and cameraman Arthur Edison. The Romania-born Negulesco began as a painter, and his earliest jobs in Hollywood were as a set decorator and designer, before he began directing shorts, mostly for Warner Brothers. His graduation to features was supposed to come with the 1941 remake of The Maltese Falcon, but at the last minute, he was replaced by another up-and-comer making his directing debut, John Huston. Negulesco directed his first feature, Singapore Woman, that same year, and 2 years later, in 1943, he began shooting his second film, The Mask of Demetrios, where he showed the flair for atmospheric art direction and mysterious moodiness that became a stylistic trademark. After Nobody Lives Forever, he'd immediately re-team with John Garfield and Joan Crawford for the noir-stained Humoresque, one of the most stylish musical melodramas ever. The supporting cast includes many familiar faces: Walter Brennan, a bit hard to believe him as a crook, George Tobias, Richard Gaines, James Flavin, and Richard Erdman in a nice bit part as a hotel bellboy. Faye Emerson, daughter-in-law of then-President Franklin Roosevelt, offers a nice turn as a not-too-fatal femme fatale. As the villain of the piece, British-born stage actor George Coulouris, once a member of the famed Mercury Theatre Company, has a field day chewing up everything that isn't nailed down. This one's a noir with a soft-boiled heart, as W.R. Burnett creates his version of a Damon Runyon story, featuring a gaggle of crooks filled with more mirth than menace. From 1946, Nobody Lives Forever.